Sometimes the best stories are told around a campfire. Campfire Stories, finding God in the flames. Have you ever felt utterly and completely alone? Like there was nobody and no one that you could turn to. About 13 years ago, I was experiencing the most difficult time in my life. I had just moved into a new community. I had a new baby. I lived in a new home, or at least new to me. It was supposed to be an exciting period of my life, but instead it was the single most challenging and isolating experience of my short years on the planet. For you see, my struggling marriage had crumbled. I was now a single dad. I lived in an apartment that I couldn't afford, and I paid a mortgage on a house that I didn't live in. My congregation was looking to me for leadership, and I could barely get myself dressed in the morning. And so I remember one day as I was heading to the hospital to make a hospital visit, my heart began to race. I broke out in a sweat, and I pulled over to the side of the road because I was having a panic attack. I had never felt so truly alone and isolated in my entire life. It was almost as if God Himself had abandoned me. If you have ever felt this way, then I'd like to tell you some stories. These stories are for you. Our first story begins about 170 years before Christ. A Greek man named Antiochus Epiphanes became king of the mighty Seleucid Empire. Now, the Seleucid Empire ruled a large area encompassing Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, and Lebanon. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted more. He wanted the jewel of the ancient Near East, a little territory you may have heard of called Egypt. Because of a mountain range here and a desert here, if he wanted to march down from here to here, do you know where he needed to travel? Well, through this small strip of land, which we call the Holy Land, Judah. That made this tiny, little, teeny-weeny strip of land extremely valuable to control. You may recognize it as the home of the Hebrew people. Now, before Antiochus Epiphanes ascended the throne, the conquered people of Israel, they lived under what was called a suzerainty. Have you ever heard of that? It means that you basically get to live your life as you always did, but you lived it under somebody else's rule. It was very common back then. It meant that you were a tributary state, but with internal autonomy. Think of it sort of like leasing a car. You pay forward a monthly fee for the privilege of driving your own car. You can drive it anywhere you want, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really belong to you, and you're going to have to give it back. But when Antiochus ascended the throne, he came into conflict with Judea over who should be appointed the high priest. The Jewish people living there, they figured they should probably be able to pick who was high priest, but he disagreed. In the end, he overturned the suzerainty that they had lived under. He deposed the high priest. His name was Jason, which happens to be my middle name, and he replaced him with a more Seleucid friendly and probably more pliable man named Menelaus. Of course, it didn't hurt that Menelaus had traveled to see them and tell them that if he was elected as high priest, that he would in fact give them half of the treasury in the temple. So this led to something called the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabees were a family led by Judas Maccabeus and his 4 brothers. The rebellion started as a guerrilla movement in the Judea countryside, raiding towns, terrorizing Greek officials far from direct Seleucid control, but it eventually developed into a fully capable army, capable of attacking even fortified Seleucid cities. And so this became a big problem for Antiochus. In 164 BC, the Maccabees actually conquered Jerusalem, and they succeeded in cleansing the temple from all oppression. It was a significant early victory. The subsequent cleansing of the temple, the rededication of the altar, is a source for the celebration of Hanukkah, which we know today, a very favorite holiday with Jewish kids even today. Sadly, this victory would not last very long, and Israel's autonomy, as has been the case throughout history, would be short-lived. Not long after the Maccabees' victory in Jerusalem, the revolt would be firmly and decidedly squashed. The leaders would be killed, and the survivors, well, they were left feeling utterly and completely alone. They had lost their war, they had lost their leaders, they had lost their home, they had lost pretty much all hope whatsoever. It may have even seemed to them that God had abandoned them. It was during this time that the people began searching for a sign, some sign, any kind of sign that God had not left them. And they found that sign in a very old tale of a man who lived a few hundred years before, who endured a very, very similar situation. His name was Daniel. Now, Daniel was born around 620 BC, and he was a young man of faith. He was steeped in the traditions of the Torah and of his forefathers. When he was a teenager, the Babylonians invaded Judah. They carried off the best and the brightest to work their fields and to serve their new masters. While Daniel was among the best of the best and the brightest of the brightest. He, along with 3 of his countrymen, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they end up finding themselves serving in the courts of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure you're familiar with that term, Nebuchadnezzar, that name. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, if you might remember, had insomnia. The burden of office weighed heavily upon him. He had terrible dreams that kept him up at night. None of his advisors could interpret his dreams and help him get a solid 8 hours. So, in what might be considered a bit of an overreaction, he determined and ordered that all of his advisors be killed, including Daniel and his friends. Well, as the story goes, it just so happens, and this happens quite a few times in the Bible, Daniel was really good at interpreting dreams. And so, with the help of his God, Yahweh, he interpreted the king's dream. When the king was finally able to have a good night rest, much like my wife the other day, woke up feeling favorably disposed towards Daniel and his countrymen. This made a lot of people jealous. Why was this foreigner getting all the attention and we get nothing? After all, he doesn't dress like us, he doesn't talk like us, or even worship the same gods that we worship. Well, some time goes by. Nebuchadnezzar is replaced by his son, who is then replaced by a guy named Darius the Mede. But no matter how often the crown changed hands, one thing remained true. Daniel was always an outsider. We pick up the story in chapter 6. The administrators, the satraps, all of those folks, they went as a group to the king and they said, "King, live forever. We have this issue. We need to make sure that we are enforcing a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown in the lion's den." Now, of course, this was their plot. This was their way of getting Daniel tricked up. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Well, I think you know how the story goes. Daniel refuses to worship any other god than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In fact, and I like this is a boss move, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, nice and high, for everyone to see, where the windows opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Now, the king seemed to really like Daniel. But when he found out that Daniel was disobeying this decree, he had no choice but to uphold his own law. So, when all of those people who were jealous of Daniel finally brought to his attention what Daniel was doing, the king reluctantly gave the order, brought Daniel, and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, and this is ominous, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." And as they tossed Daniel into the pit, heaved a huge stone over the top, and sealed it with the royal seal, you have to wonder if there had ever been a time in Daniel's life that he had ever felt more alone. Separated from his friends, his homeland, and now soon his very life. He had nobody. It may have even seemed to him that God had abandoned him. Well, if you are familiar with Daniel, I bet you're familiar with his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were not necessarily, you might say, appreciated in Babylon either. They too proved to be smart and capable young men. They garnered no shortage of jealousy from their peers. Now, this story takes place before Daniel spent a night with the lions, back when Nebuchadnezzar still held the throne. In chapter 3, we read, Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high, 9 and 6 cubits wide, set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this is a 90-foot statue. One would wonder why he would feel the need to erect such a massive monolith, probably for the same reason my neighbor has a lifted Chevy. Well, as the story goes, Nebuchadnezzar erected a 90-foot tall statue. He demanded that everyone bow down at set times and worship the massive golden idol. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. Of course, when the music sounded, everybody bowed down except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who remained standing. Well, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned these 3 guys. They were brought before the king. He said, "Is it true that you won't get with the program, that you won't do what you're asked to do? Let's be clear, if you don't, you will be thrown into a blazing furnace. And then, what God," he says, "will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Oh, it's almost like he's tempting fate, isn't it? But separated from their friends, their homeland, and soon their very lives, these 3 guys had nobody. It may have even seemed that God had abandoned them, but he had not. He had not. I think you know how the rest of the story goes. Shadrach and Benny refuse to acquiesce to the irate king's demands. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like this reply. He's used to getting his own way. He gets so angry, he says, "Stoke the furnace up 7 times hotter than normal." They bind up these 3 guys. They throw them into the fiery furnace. It's so hot that those throwing these 3 guys in, they also lose their lives from the heat. And the king stood and watched with smug satisfaction, at least for a few minutes. But then something happened. King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." And as the 3 young men emerged from the fire, completely unscathed, it was clear to the king that even in the fiery furnace, these 3 young men were not alone. Let's go forward to Daniel's story once again. King Darius did not sleep much the night that he threw Daniel into the lion's pit. Not because of a terrible dream, but because he genuinely liked Daniel. And nobody, and I mean nobody, who had ever spent a night with a lion had ever lived to tell the tale. Unless it's a Disney movie, of course. So at the first light of dawn, the king got up, he hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" It's almost like he's hoping, like he's wishing that everything he thought about the gods was wrong and that Daniel was right. Well, Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions." As Daniel was lifted out of the lion's den, completely unscathed, it was clear to the king that even in the lion's den, even in that darkest pit, Daniel was not alone. Church, I want to tell you today that neither are you. Neither are we. There is an angel in the lion's den. There is a 4th man in the fire. And 13 years ago, as I sat crying on the side of that road, there was someone with me as well. He was with me. And because God was with me, I could dry my eyes, I could put the car back in gear, and I could drive back on to the hospital and be a blessing to a family in need. I could face what lay ahead saying, "My God will deliver me from this time. And even if he does not, I will remain faithful." And so day by day and week by week, I remained as faithful as I could in the small tasks that God sent before me. The preparation of a sermon, visiting someone in the hospital, taking my son to a Little League game, whatever it was that I was called to do that day. I did it. And then I simply let God take care of the rest. For he had not and never has abandoned me. Dear church, this is exactly the kind of hope that those Hebrew people needed in 170 BC. After the Maccabean revolt failed, they were decimated, they were afraid, they were alone. But they remembered the stories of Daniel and his 3 friends who remained faithful to God even when they had no reason to do so, who refused to bow down to idols, who refused to stop praying, who knew that their God could deliver them, and that even if he didn't, they would remain faithful to their last breath. And so, the book of Daniel is likely a very late addition to what we call the Old Testament, which many call the Hebrew Scriptures. It may even be the last book written, at least in the form, in the state that we have it today. And we believe this because the opening verses are all written in Hebrew. And the end of the book is written in Hebrew. But the middle section is written in Aramaic. I think these amazing stories of Daniel and his friends were written in Aramaic because the language of those who over centuries of persecution had lost their mother tongue was replaced by Aramaic. And so they wrote down these stories in the language that they had to go along with what they already knew. But they never lost their stories. They never lost the stories of Daniel. They may have lost their language, but they didn't lose the story. They may have lost may have lost their language, but they never lost the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they never lost the stories of all those who remained true, even when all seemed lost. So they wrote these stories down. They passed them around. They reminded each other that one day, their God would deliver them. That they just needed to remain faithful day by day. For there is a 4th man in the fire. And then one day, about 200 years later, another young Hebrew stood before a foreign king. He too refused to bow to idols. He too upset his jealous peers. He too was innocent and found guilty. He too was sentenced to death, a stone rolled across his grave and sealed, like Daniel before him, with a royal seal. When they came to his tomb early the next day, they found that the stone had been rolled away, but not by thieves. He was alive. No king could destroy him. Even death could not contain him. After all, it was he who walked in the fiery furnace in Babylon. It was he who shut the lion's mouth in the pit. And it was he who was with me that day 13 years ago at the side of the road. And it is he who is with us even now. For he is our Lord and our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. And he is the 4th man in the fire. So if you have ever felt completely and utterly alone, like there was nobody and no one that you could turn to, that maybe even God had abandoned you, well, these stories are for you. Remember, Daniel was not alone in the lion's den. Shadrach and Benny were not alone in that fiery furnace. And you are not alone either. There is a 4th man in the fire. So remain faithful, stay true, do the right thing day by day, and let God work out the rest. For the reality is, he is still writing your story. I'm going to invite the music team to come forward and ask them to lead us in a special piece of music that has come to mean a lot to me lately. And I'd love for you to pay attention to the words of this song. For those of you who face a great trial, these words are for you. Now, following the special music, we're going to share in a celebration of the Lord's table together. So let us prepare our hearts for the nearness of God's presence, remembering that he is in the room.